Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. The American Studies Journal is so incredibly pleased to celebrate the publication of this 2020 special issue, The Arts in the Black Press During the Age of Jim Crow. We're excited to have this conversation and hope that there'll be lots and lots of questions at the end of the discussion. My name is Christopher Pereira. I'm Assistant Professor of American Studies and Latinx Studies at the University of Kansas. I also serve as Associate Editor of the American Studies Journal and as editor of the journal's blog. The American Studies Journal has been sponsored by KU's libraries, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Mid-America American Studies Association. We thank them for all of that support. I'll be introducing the panelists this evening in just a second, and then we can jump into the discussion. But first, I wanted to acknowledge that the American Studies Journal, housed at the University of Kansas for over 60 years, does this work on the ancestral territory of several tribal nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Shawnee peoples. We wish to acknowledge the sovereignty of the 4 federally recognized tribes of Kansas, the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, the Kickapoo tribe in Kansas, the Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska, and the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. Let me begin with introduction so we can move quickly into our panel discussion and save as much time as possible for all of that good stuff. These will be somewhat abbreviated bios, but we'll include links in the chat to longer faculty bios. Okay, here we go. Erica Richardson is Assistant Professor of the English Department at Baruch College at CUNY. She received her BA from Wellesley College and her PhD from Columbia University. Her research and teaching interests include African American print culture, Black women's writing, and African American drama. Her current work considers the intimate discursive and epistemological relations between dispossession and Black life within an archive of Black literary production and social data from the end of Reconstruction. Michelle R. Scott is Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Her research and teaching interests include African American history, women's history, Black musical culture, and civil rights movements. Professor Scott's book, Blues Empress in Black Chattanooga, Bessie Smith and the Emerging Urban South, I see it right there on the screen, was published by the University of Illinois Press. Her forthcoming manuscript is entitled Toba Time. Is that correct? Yes. Black Vaudeville and the Theater Owners Booking Association in Jazz Age Era. Kristen M. Turner is lecturer in the Music and Honors Department at North Carolina State University, a musicologist. Her research centers on race and class in American middlebrow culture at the turn of the 20th century. Her work appears in the Journal of Society for American Music, the Journal of Musicological Research, the Cambridge Companion to Gershwin, and as guest co-editor of this special issue in American Studies. Lucy Caplan teaches in the History and Literature Department program at Harvard University. Her current book project explores how 20th century African Americans redefined the genre of opera as a wellspring of anti-racism activism, collective sociality, and aesthetic innovation. Her writing appears in African American Arts, Activism, Aesthetics, and Futurity. I believe that's an edited collection, and the Journal of Society for American Music. She is the recipient of the 2016 Rubin Prize for Music Criticism and also guest co-editor of this special issue featured tonight. Finally, our moderator, Dr. Randal Jelks, is Professor of African and African American Studies and American Studies at KU. He holds a courtesy appointment in History, Religious Studies, and is co-editor with Sherry Tucker of the Journal of American Studies. He is the author of 2 award-winning books, African Americans in the Furniture City, The Struggle for Civil Rights in Grand Rapids, and Benjamin Elijah Mays, Schoolmaster of the Movement, a biography. His latest is titled Faith and Struggle in the Lives of Four African Americans: Ethel Waters, Mary Lou Williams, Eldred Cleaver, and Muhammad Ali. That was Bloomsbury this past 2019. Dr. Jelks' forthcoming book is titled Letters to Martin, Meditations on Democracy in Black America, Lawrence Hill Books, and that's forthcoming in 2021. In addition to this and many other things, he serves as an executive producer of a film documentary, I Too Sing America, Langston Hughes Unfurled, directed by Kevin Wilmot. I'll keep it short there. Thank you everybody for joining, and please welcome our guest tonight.
Thank you, Chris, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all. So we'll proceed in this manner. I want to start out with the guest editors because as editors of the journal, we receive weekly article submissions or even guest submissions. And we got this submission right after we just had published a special issue on the Black West. And we're like, oh my, we got another issue, and we said, okay, well, let's present this to our editorial board, and they unanimously, they liked the proposal. And so I want Lucy and Kristen, I'm going to just be informal here, or the doctors, to say what gave you the idea about studying the arts in the Black press during the age of Jim Crow. So what were you thinking? What was your research interest in this? So can you explain to our audience?
Do you want me to start, Lucy, or do you?
Sure. Do you want to start and then I can take over from there?
Okay. Well, let's see. Lucy and I are both work on music, and we were introduced via email by Naomi Andre, who is a very important musicologist who works in Michigan, at University of Michigan. And we started just trying to think of something that we could do together because we were both interested in music and music by Black performers and Black musicians in general in this turn of the century period. And eventually we decided to hold a conference on arts in the Black press because we were trying to open things up. We talked a lot about how there's so much amazing work being done about Black communities through the Black press and about all the arts, not just music. And I will let Lucy pick it up from there because we did have that conference.
Sure. So this was all the way back in 2016 when we came up with the idea for the conference, and then it was held at Yale in March 2017, so about exactly 4 years ago. And what we were hoping to do with this event is really kind of, shift the focus from thinking about the Black press not only as a locus of kind of political activism and social commentary, but also thinking about the role that it played in the world of the arts, and also, of course, how those things are always intertwined, kind of the world of social and political critique, and also the world of what's happening in the sphere of the arts and performance. So we were, we didn't, as with any kind of event, we had no idea what the level of interest would be, and we were really gratified to get a huge number of proposals and kind of people working on all sorts of fascinating topics. So much so that we ended up having a much bigger conference than we had initially intended. I think we had 36 presenters and around 100 attendees at the conference itself. And Erica was one of the presenters there with us at that event, as were many other contributors to the special issue. So, it was just really exciting to see how much intellectual energy there was around this topic. So after the conference concluded, we thought about how we could kind of carry that energy forward into a more kind of permanent project. And we thought that American Studies would really be a perfect home for that work, given the kind of interdisciplinary scope of the journal and the way that we were thinking about the role of the arts in the Black press.
Yeah. Well, when you chose the title "The Arts," I mean, it's so expansive. Were you specifically at that moment thinking about music, or I mean, thinking about Ciceretta Jones? I'm thinking about all of the Will Marion Cook, all of the musicians of the era that you could. And the Black press was so expansive, right? I mean, I forget the number of newspapers now, but they were all over the country. And so did you kind of limit that scope? Did you kind of think about the limitations of that scope at the time of the conference?
I think we were trying to be as broad as possible, and we were also so aware from our own work how much the Black press was opening up that every day practically there were more journals going online in various databases. So, and more still, certainly since 2017. So I think we were both very aware of how, the archive was growing every day. It is just sort of happenstance that there are no music papers in the actual journal. We had plenty of papers about music in the actual conference. In fact, I think for me, and I'll see if Lucy agrees with me, I felt like it was the most truly interdisciplinary conference I've ever been to, in the sense of the number of different disciplinary homes of the people that presented, and the fact that they were truly engaging in true interdisciplinary work, where they were really engaging work from all sorts of different disciplines. Sometimes interdisciplinarity isn't as interdisciplinary as it seems, but I really felt like our conference was unusually rich in that respect.
Yeah, the Black press is so regional. I mean, and you have the major cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and then you have all of these other, and even within the cities, there are smaller papers that now no longer exist at that time. So what? One of the questions I had is, when I was reading through, I was like, "Where's the dance?" Because this dance was always controversial. Whether one was talking about young Josephine Baker, or one was talking, about kind of tap dance and what it might have signified. I was also thinking, did people present on dance too as well?
Go ahead, Lucy.
I'm not recalling that there were any papers on dance per se, but there were certainly a lot of papers on kind of stage performance. And of course, Michelle's work on vaudeville kind of speaks to that complexity and the way that there were a lot of kind of papers addressing people doing interdisciplinary work. We also had a keynote by Kim Gallen, who does amazing work, as everyone here knows, on kind of gender and sexuality in the Black press. And she talked about stage performers as well. But, I think to kind of return to your earlier question about the arts as a category, one of the things that I also find so interesting about the kind of Black press sources that we were looking at is how intertwined the arts coverage is in those sources. If you look at the arts page or the theater page, there's just everything. There's, opera and dance and vaudeville and music and literature kind of all together on the same page. And that, I think, kind of inspired us to take a broad view of the topic, because it's so broad and capacious in the sources themselves.
I don't remember a dance paper either, but I also, one reason that we didn't get any papers that I recall about dance either. So that's, no one wanted to talk about it, I guess, or, not in that forum. But I do think one reason we don't have music articles is because of the way that the particular authors that we got talked about the Black press. We really wanted to have authors who were doing what Michelle and Erica did, which was really use the Black press as a site of more than just data or information, but also as a sort of creation, a site of creation itself. And a lot of papers, frankly, and often how I use music too, is just finding out when and where and who did things. So it's really a data mining issue. And of course, there are plenty of ways not to use music coverage like that, but it just so happened the papers we got were not using the press in quite the way that we were hoping for this particular issue.
Well, this is exciting because I'm sure that, I mean, these are only a selection of the work, but there's so much work will continue to come out about this. As I said to you all earlier, working on Langston Hughes, I mean, of course, there are lots of criticisms of Hughes's blues style inflected poetry. The Chicago Bee calling him the poet low rate. So there are all kinds of ways that the arts are covered, and there's a debate about respectability and respectability politics of the arts, because the arts of all kinds, whether it's painting, sculpture, dance, pushes the envelope. So using that proverbial language, pushes the envelope. So with that, let's go to the contributors. Erica, you have this interesting a title about desire, dispossession, dreams of social data, Black club women's intellectual thought and aesthetics during the progressive era in public writing and print culture. Tell us a little bit more about what you were trying to do there.
I'd be glad to. Thank you, Randall. So I wanted to first actually acknowledge the conversation we've been having so far, thinking a lot about what is the press capable of doing, particularly for Black arts or for the Black community. And I was very much struck by the introduction that Lucy and Kristen wrote when they said the press is not just a repository, which got me actually helped me figure my own work within this edition, thinking about the press as more than a repository, more than just data, even though I do think about data, but rather a site for constructing possibility, for finding information, but also deciding what that information might actually do, particularly within the constraints of the era of Jim Crow. And this is essentially the idea at stake in my piece, where I am thinking about Black club women who were reformers in the late 19th through the early 20th century. Their peak is basically 1890s through 1910 or so. But even as they are doing that reform work, they are gathering data to inform their work so that they know, what does the Black community need? Where can we do the most work, whether it be anti-lynching causes or helping create kindergartens and so on and so forth. And while there are lots of critiques that are and should be made about their respectability politics, particularly around ideas of sexuality, which is something that I think Michelle will have more to talk about as well. In this work, I was very much thinking about, how does data inform and idealize aesthetic practice? So how does social data, or the data that we think we have that is circulating within popular culture during this time period, particularly about Black women, informing the way they're represented? And so in this piece, I saw the Black press, particularly the Woman's Era, a Black club woman's periodical, as bringing together this desire for data, this desire for truth, and recognizing the limits of current representation. And so what happens when the data doesn't do enough? What happens when either you gather that information and it still doesn't quite push back at sort of these hegemonic and also prejudiced ideas of Black female sexuality and gender? That's where I argue that Black women are sort of refashioning that data through the press, through this sort of like liminal space of both aesthetic, but also public opinion, but also this sort of institution of knowledge about social life. So that's what my work focuses on. And again, it's like I see it communicating a great deal with Michelle's work, and I'm so excited to hear more about her process and her thoughts as well.
So one more question. I mean, the idea of club women are, it's sort of mythic that they're somehow distant from the ordinary goings on of life, and they're very much collecting all kinds of, as you say, data about the lives of girls and trying to figure out both their laboring conditions as physical labor, work, job, laboring conditions, and other things. So what I found fascinating about that article was to see that kind of work, and it defies the kind of stereotypes that they are these sort of sipping tea kind of women in club life. And often those women, of course, were many of them who formed those clubs were maids themselves. So, so I found that fascinating, and so thank you for that piece. And Michelle, I want to talk to you about Toba because I really thought that this to help enlighten our people, theater folk, stage advice columns in the 1920s Chicago Defender is also a place. I lived in Chicago, so I grew up my life on the Defender, reading it, but not reading it then in the 1920s. And also because my own work is that I wrote about Mary Lou Williams and Ethel Waters, both of them. And of course, Ethel's memoir is one of the best books on performing life. If you ever want to read a book about Black performing life, His Eyes on the Sparrow is one of the great books about it. Tell us what made you want to take up Toba? And I think Toba that was characterized tough on Black asses, as I remember.
Yes, that was the underground name for it. Yes.
So tell us about this article and why you wanted to make this contribution here.
Well, the article itself is about Vivian Gordon Russell as a former chorus girl who ends up writing a column for The Defender between 1925 and 1926. And as I was working on my book on Toba, on the Theater Owners Booking Association, I got all of this information about the negative backlash that performers on Toba received, both within the Black community and without, about it being immoral behavior. They're pulling away from God's music. They're singing the blues, the devil's music, which I had read a lot about when I did my work on Bessie Smith. And so when I was using the Black press, particularly The Defender, I was kind of looking for anyone in The Defender to speak for these vaudevillians, particularly vaudevillian women. And I came across the article with the byline Vivian. And it actually, if I can share my screen really quickly. It just had the initial theater folks and theater goers by Vivian with no discussion of who Vivian was. And so the historian part of me decided I wanted to figure out the biography and the background of who Vivian was. And I found this discussion of the fact that she was a chorus girl involved in some of the early productions off Broadway in the 19-teens. And all of the discussions that she had in trying to survive and coming from a very religious family and really dealing with the own backlash that she received from her very devout Baptist mother and going into this world of chorus life. And that by the 1920s, when she's writing this column, she's in a double act with her husband, Strawberry Russell, who was a former blackface comedian. And she decides to kind of have a how-to column. So there are a lot of young Black men and women writing to her about how do I get on the stage? How do I audition? What is that process like? And reading her responses to these young men and women really talked about a greater discussion of how she kind of reformed this idea of respectability and that the arts in itself was a respectable profession in her eyes. And it was a profession, a training and a calling. She had several articles where she talked about, really spoke to parents of these, budding performers to say, let your children actually go to school to learn to sing, to learn to dance, to learn the arts in itself. Otherwise, they will be pulled away by the vices of the street, right? So she really saw it as a stopgap measure at the same time that it was something that was like cherishing the wit and the mastery of Black art and entertainment. And so the Vivian articles, were a labor of love in the sense that I had to go through all of this genealogical material to find out who Vivian was. She was given no last name. I actually found her background through her husband and the census data and the city directories. And she only mentions Toba in her columns maybe twice out of the 30 plus columns that she writes. But she really gives voice to the labor experiences, particularly of young women and chorus girls, to say, let's put aside the fact that there are criticisms of them being immoral, and look to see how many hours a day they work for how little pay they actually receive in comparison to their male counterparts and the producers on these shows. So she was talking about labor politics. She was discussing cultural appropriation. She really spelled it out. And one thing I love about The Defender is that the columnists don't mince words. And she was very much upfront about the fact that she was getting paid a certain amount to be on these vaudeville shows, whereas white women who would be singing and mimicking the antics, the voice, and the posturing of Black women would receive that much more, right? And so she's saying, unless you have Black men and women actually championing their own art, you're going to have imitators receiving more money, becoming you and a better version of you on stage. So it became more than just the art of where she was performing, how she was performing. And she has an international act that tours with her husband, but it became a critique on the American entertainment system at large. And so from a little blip of Toba mentioning, I got into the world of Vivian. But the times that she does talk about Toba, she's very hard on the producers, both Black and white producers of the circuit, for their failings of not actually championing the young Black men and women who are performing.
Yeah, the exploitation. I mean, one of the things that you quickly discover when you enter into this world is the exploitation of the performers. That is very much so. And I didn't know who Vivian was, and so thank you for bringing her back to life. And again, this goes with Erica's own piece about the way, in this case, women are trying to recreate a narrative, trying to restructure a narrative or reframe a narrative about their lives and the lives of what they're doing and performing, and so forth. I would add, as I think about some older work, like Terrible Honesty, that this is also equally true in different ways for white ethnics, Jews, other people are the kind of questions of morality, immorality about the arts and singing, that these are lives out of control. They are, preaching pronouncements against the arts and so forth. So, what would you say is why the, and I'm asking this for the whole group, why the age of Jim Crow is so important in this title? Because it's the arts and the Black press, not just the arts, but in the age of Jim Crow. What do you think that this apartheid, how did it constrain the arts, and how did it also help make the arts flourish? Anybody? I
can start, or Erica, did you want to go?
Sure, you must have seen me unmute myself. So going back to what you were saying, Randall, about these different, like the Jewish experience, the influx of, probably we're also thinking European immigrants, all within this era, especially if we're thinking like this early part of Jim Crow. There is a way in which I think the nation itself was trying to formulate its identity with all these influxes of modernity. So there are these shared lines of thought, these shared anxieties about what's happening as people are sort of like mixing and touching and like getting closer to each other in cities, and having that moment of sort of sensuality, but also change being expressed through performance itself. And so I wanted to acknowledge that there are these kind of parallels, but at the same time, as in all cases, when we focus in on the experience of a social group and the historical sort of conditions that shape it, when we think about Jim Crow is like this magnificent and like thorough system of anti-Black violence and prejudice that is like shapes so many aspects of Black life. But then in turn, you have so many moments of ingenuity in response to that violence. And so when I'm thinking about the importance of having this phrase, Jim Crow, it's not just a signifier about a time period, it's also a signifier about how sort of Black art or Black excellence emerges out of these moments of constraint. And I think very much so, like in Michelle's work, there was this moment where, Michelle, you're talking about how Vivian acknowledges respectability politics, but also the pleasure of art itself. How like going to the theater is a kind of escape, is a way to have Black people enjoy, you know, their lives and their work in a way that doesn't always have place and belonging in the larger sort of context of this socio, like political and cultural moment. And now I'm done. Go for it, Lucy.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was so beautifully stated. And I think you're kind of focused on, you know, the cultural experiences that are necessitated by Jim Crow or kind of emerge out of Jim Crow is really helpful. And I would just maybe elaborate on that by saying that I think the formation of kind of Black cultural institutions during this time is so key to understanding kind of the development of the arts during the Jim Crow era and how kind of certain types of artistic experience are able to flourish at this time. I mean, kind of thinking about Black theaters and literary magazines like the ones that you talk about in your work, Erica, and all these different kind of sites for communal and collective cultural expression, I think is really key to thinking about, you know, it's not just the story of Black artists trying to break into segregated spaces or kind of trying to break down Jim Crow, but it's also all the work that kind of occurs within Black cultural institutions. Imani Perry's work on Black formalism is really helpful here, I think, for thinking about that. She talks about lift every voice and sing and the kind of notion of Black formal cultures emerging in these segregated spaces. And then Kristen and I cite in the introduction Gerald Horne's work on the Jim Crow paradox, which is his term for thinking about how the institutions that kind of are born out of Jim Crow and emerge out of this cultural moment ultimately kind of create the conditions for their own demise or for their own disappearance, in that once they critique that system successfully enough and start to kind of break down the barriers of segregation, they no longer have as prominent a place in the cultural landscape. So I think for us, that was a really helpful way of thinking about kind of why the Jim Crow era is the focus. And also maybe just to state the obvious, like there's so much incredible artistic creativity and cultural creativity during this era that is treated so beautifully in the press, and that alone is kind of, you know, reason enough to think more about it.
Right, because the press has visual culture, as we've seen from some of the earlier slides. I mean, the photographs, particularly in the crisis, the work by our own Kansas Aaron Douglas and so forth. Maybe many of you don't know that George Walker of Williams and Walker was from Lawrence, Kansas, and is buried in Lawrence here. So this idea of the theater, the Black press, the efforts to go on the Great White Way, it's a whole history waiting to be carved out of these mini regional newspapers. I'm certainly interested in. Now I had a grad student do a dissertation on Black Kansas club women, believe it or not, even in these small areas and rural areas. And so now I want to go back and say, wow, what are the sources about artistic expression? Because this is all over the place. what, but back to this comparative ethnic thing. I mean, this is going all over the place. People are trying to create community, new kind of community institution, new kinds of, say, American institutions. What is there anything in this issue that you would have wanted more from the guest editors?
I'm not sure. Are you asking us?
Yeah, I'm asking
or Erica
you,
and Michelle about us?
If you said, okay, I wish we'd have had an article on this. Oh, is there anything? I'm pleased with the issue as one of the editors, but there's always things like, oh, I wish.
Well, I know. I mean, because I'm a musicologist, I missed the fact that we didn't have an article that was specifically about music in some way. I mean, Michelle, of course, is touching on vaudeville. My own work is on vaudeville, just 10 or 15 years before what Michelle does. So, I think that, I don't know. For me, anyway. I think one of the things that's such a strength about the Black press is to be able to see so many different viewpoints are coming through. It really puts down the idea of this monolithic Black thought where, in earlier scholarship, you might get one viewpoint from one sort of high profile person that sort of broke into the white press or broke into white society, and being able to look at the Black press really, and seeing so many different outlets to look at, we really see the richness of the intellectual as well as artistic life in the Black press. So it would have been cool to have a music article that sort of mined that a little bit. It just didn't work out for this, but I mean, the music criticism and the theatrical criticism in the Black press is amazing and so rich, and so once you there is sort of a period early on when everybody was great, except with Sylvester Russell, he thought nobody was good. But once you get past that, you really see how rich and how many different ideas there are that really, again, show that the richness of this Black communities and how they felt about the art and other topics. So I don't know, Lucy, if
I was interested in the arts because many of the arts are performed in religious spaces, right? Because that's the institutions that people actually control and own. Sociologically speaking, they control and own their religious institutions, and so the link between religiosity and this comes up for Mary Lou Williams and certainly Ethel Waters, the tie. This is where people, for singers, their first performing space, or pianists. And I wondered, did it at the conference, or did you see any papers on that tension and tie between those things that runs all the way into the 20th century as well, maybe the 21st century?
That's a great point. I don't recall that the conference had a lot of papers focused on kind of religious spaces per se, although I think that would have added a lot to both the conference and the issue to kind of broaden the focus in that way and think about kind of churches and religious spaces as also performance spaces. In response to your earlier question about, what directions we could expand in, I recall that at the conference, we had some really great panels on the transnational Black press and on papers published outside the United States, which was really so fascinating to kind of bring that perspective into the conversation. And just kind of by virtue of the submissions that we received and how things worked out, that ended up not being as much of a focus of the special issue. But I think kind of bringing in that more transnational or maybe diasporic perspective would just kind of continue to broaden our sense of what the Black press is doing at this time and how Jim Crow has global ramifications.
So I would ask,
did you have something you wanted to say? I saw you unmute.
It was actually on the question of the tension between the secular and the sacred, which Vivian does start to talk about near the end of her columns, primarily because she's wrestling with those tensions in her own life. And she actually starts to write the last series of columns don't deal with the theater specifically. They more talk about the fact that it's possible to be spiritual and to have a worship life and also to be a performer at the same time, and that they're not separate from each other. And it's interesting to see how she deals with the backlash of some people who write in who are saying, do you know anything of God? How dare you as a woman speak to these issues or speak at all? Where she's saying, you know, the theater is not the problem with the morality of African Americans. You can have just as many people in church who are just as immoral as any, you know, person who you speculate may be practicing this immorality on the stage. So she really starts to talk in a way where she's actually talking about scripture that you don't expect to see from someone who was, you know, the former chorus girl who played in Darktown Follies. So this tension is ever present. And it's interesting to see how performers themselves wrestle with it when they're in that theater space.
And I would just like to respond a little bit to those comments, Michelle, because they get at this kind of parallel I see between my work and yours, especially how Vivian is a critic. She's an artist and a critic, and she's in the industry. And I don't know, maybe it's because I was recently like watching the Grammys, you know, I'm thinking about how like Black women artists are in fact commenting on what the values and standards of an industry should be. And in the process end up reshaping our ideas about what roles women can have and sort of typically pushing back against respectability politics. And so when I was listening to you talk about how like she moves between the secular and the religious, I think it's just showing the sort of breadth of, you know, all the discourses she's drawing upon, the industry, the artistry, and understanding that the secular and the religious are not actually as separate as we think. And in that process, we get perhaps a more generative, or at the very least, a less constraining idea of like Black women's respectability politics, what kind of Black woman can even be, which gets me to my own ideas about thinking about what kind of Black woman can even be when you have that pervasive sort of hypersexualized figure haunting every Black woman. For Black club women, I found that they were turning to sociology not simply because that was the discourse that, you know, the government and sort of authoritative public voices were manipulating and using, but also because they knew that what I do in my house, how I take care of my home, how women in my community clean their houses and cook together or talk to one another, whether it's that ideal version, again, Black club women do have a critique of the working class or not, there is something in that labor that is actually a combination of both practice and thought about how we can be. And so I think it's important to note that Vivian is in the industry, aware of her position in the industry. And it reminds me of sort of a similar thing that I'm recognizing with Black club women. They see themselves doing that reform work and they understand it as a position of authority from which they can talk about their lives.
So one of the things that I was struck by throughout this is that many of the people are college educated. They've attended the historically Black college, or they dropped out. I mean, they decide that, oh, you know, I'd rather be on the, and I wonder, did you all make links about the kind of ways that, you know, this is also the era and growth of college attendance, especially with issues in the crisis. You see more and more Black women on the cover, valedictorian, the class, summa cum laude, all of those kinds of things, the ties between the arts and the colleges. Anybody?
Yeah, I can respond to this. And this kind of goes outside some of the work I presented in this edition, but still speaks to my thoughts about particularly club women, but like I often find myself drawn to what I call the bougie Black women. And it's a complicated relationship because I'm forever negotiating how elitism emerges, and also recognizing the different modes of achievement and sort of striving that occur as Black women are pursuing higher education. But there becomes this question of like, what was that education supposed to do? Were you supposed to go get your degree and find a man, or were you supposed to do something else? And I feel like that's constantly being negotiated, like in these moments, in these spaces of getting the degree, and like the decorum and the sort of status that goes along with it. Much like you were saying, Randal, like not everyone, like some people, they go to school, but they're also made. So there's this way in which they are part of both worlds, but only one thing gets that prominent attention, or at least seems to be the thing that they want to be recognized as. And I think, I don't know, I think like going up into even our contemporary moment, like we have this sort of question about, yeah, like what is this degree supposed to do? What is this sort of like continuing education supposed to do and signify? And I think looking back at these like earlier moments really reminds us that we've been sort of, and they have been really grappling with this for quite some time.
I tend to see the connections, even in the theater world, particularly in Toba, that you would assume that a lot of these performers are essentially young, they audition, they don't have time to go to school. But actually one of the Black founders of Toba, John T. Gibson, went to Morgan. And he actually heralds the fact that he went to Morgan as an HBCU in Baltimore. And he talks about his business practices, about what he learned from being a Morgan graduate. And then he becomes one of the trustees after he establishes the Standard Theater in Philadelphia. So he makes this larger connection for perhaps not formal education within the colleges, but that he then starts to open up the theaters as spaces where people can go beyond just watching a show or an evening or a matinee, but having these kind of community forums to talk about issues of politics, to talk about issues of the fighting of Jim Crow that's really occurring, and kind of this extracurricular school setting that happens in the space of the theater. And then he's leaning heavily on his HBCU education for that.
Yeah, I think just to build on what Michelle and Erica have been saying, I mean, so many theater people and musicians were actually quite highly educated and were very involved in those kinds of discussions in the earlier part of the century. And of course, you know, then you get into the Harlem Renaissance and it's a whole, that just continues. But if you think about Cecil and Blake, who wrote the music for Shuffle Along, they met at Fisk. James Weldon Johnson was a songwriter with his brother Rosamond for many years before the war, and so I think one of the byproducts of segregation is that you get people moving into perhaps into fields that they might not have otherwise because of that pressure of segregation, and moving in and using the theater as, like you were saying, Michelle, as a source of education and also as a way to negotiate respectability. I really have learned so much in the last 5 years from looking at the Black press and also learning from people who are working on, someone like Brittany Cooper, you know, working on these Black intellectuals, and understanding just how, the respectability is an incredibly complicated kind of idea, and it's so much more than I had realized, and how much the people who work in the theater and musicians and people working in the arts were really trying to negotiate what is respectability, who is respectable, and how can we present that to the public, whether that was to other Black people or to people outside the Black community. And I think I think the Black press is such a rich source for understanding that respectability is not what I thought it was anyway. It was quite a bit more complicated, but also perhaps not as elitist as we might have thought before. That there was it was a much more understanding of the lower classes and the pressures on people from the working class than it might seem from some of the earlier scholarship on it. Once you really look into it, you see more a more equalitarian respectability there.
This is my last question, then we'll turn it over. What do you want to happen with this issue? I ask all y'all, I mean, all scholars want to be cited. All scholars want their work somewhere in some, but what's your aspiration for this issue? We think highly of it, but what's your aspiration for all of you? You made a contribution in it. What do you want to happen with it? Anyone?
I can start. I mean, I think one thing I would love to see is all the contributors' work being read by students and being kind of engaged in classrooms. I think, as we've been saying, there's just a far more complex sense of Black cultural life and intellectual life and social life that emerges in the press and in the particular figures discussed in this issue that I think goes so far beyond the kind of often simplistic narratives that students have access to. So I think there's a really exciting opportunity there for students to both learn from this work and also have the chance and maybe be inspired to use the press as an archive for their own research and for their own work. So thinking of it as a pathway into encouraging students in particular and also other scholars to engage more deeply with the press, both as an archive and as a historical actor in its own right, something that I would be really excited to see.
Okay.
I think Lucy has said it so well. I don't know that I have much to add except to say that I hope this also encourages, hopefully as people read this, it encourages people who have the ability to save more Black press, more, digitize more from the Black press. Understand, I particularly am thinking of the opening article where there's a whole newspaper that has disappeared and apparently it was sort of discarded at Duke University, perhaps not realizing that was a precious archive of material that was not, is in no other library as far as we know. So I hope it encourages people to just continue not only using the Black press, but preserving it as well.
Yes, I fully concur there. As doing historical work, many smaller newspapers just got tossed, so to speak. So yes. Erica, Michelle, do you have anything? What do you want to see happen with this work?
I'll go next. And this is also a moment that I did want to actually wanted more people to know my name. So I'm going to briefly screen share my contact information as I talk a little bit about what this entire edition actually has meant for me. So what I appreciated about this special edition, and very much the work that Lucy and Kristen have done bringing these pieces together, is just how interdisciplinary it is, and how the press, again, is thought of this act of preservation, but also thinking beyond like repository and thinking about what the press can do. So as I am multitasking, yes, this is my little slide. If people would like to reach out, reading this entire special edition, I started thinking about Benedict Anderson in Imagine Communities, where he talks about print capitalism. In particular, this idea how the press creates this idea of imagined community, creates nation, and he's very sort of generous in that definition of print capitalism, or the potential of the press to create a nation, failing to recognize how often people are excluded from that imagining. And so when I think about the future of my own work, so I am working on a manuscript that will dig into the Black press again. I was having all sorts of vibes, Michelle, when you were talking about going through all these. I was like, it's my future, it's my now, the never-ending archive, which is I am grateful that it is online because of the circumstances of COVID-19 and because of that act of preservation. But I often find myself overwhelmed by both the gaps and the excesses of this archive. Like, how are things, like, what's the metadata? How is information organized? And what do we do for the information we do not have? So looking forward, I think about this particular compilation of work as kind of a reminder of the different methodologies we can take going into the press, that there's not just one way in, and that we don't have to we can both recognize canonical and important figures, but also canonicity doesn't mean we have to disavow anyone. That doesn't mean we have to leave anyone out. And I think about how Viviane has just her name, Viviane. I think about my own work where I focus on Petite Cherie, an author who goes by her, like, Cherie is her nickname. And this sense of these are also the voices that are informing our understanding of what the press can do, and how, like, Blackness and Black womanhood can be imagined and affirmed. So looking forward, I'm now going to stop my share. Looking forward, I am thinking about the multiple ways to engage with the Black press through such an interdisciplinary approach, and all that might yield.
For me, I think I want the article on the one hand to introduce the larger project of my book on Toba Time, which will be forthcoming in 2022, as I finish the revisions in the middle of COVID. So I'm happy that it's done and in. But the article itself is actually—
Now, who will publish it?
We're waiting on the University of Illinois Press to come through with a publication date. That's what we're waiting on. So, but it's been out there and it's been read. So the article itself is actually dedicated to my student who passed in the middle of COVID, my doctoral student, who was a practitioner of Black theater, Dr. Shirley Basefield Dunlap. And I'm more interested, and we talked about what it would do in the classroom, for making those connections between theater, arts, and the press, on a scholarly level, but also in the field, right? I think I learned as much about Black theater from Dr. Dunlap, who was a director and a professor at Morgan, that I also learned from reading the issues of the Defender or the Afro-American or the International, the Freeman. And so bringing those two worlds together and having people outside of academia is also something that I hope that people can do. So they're interested and they love the stories about Ethel Waters. And I also love that manuscript that you mentioned earlier, Randall. But then the idea about, well, what's the backstory of all that? What's involved in actually trying to survive and thrive and celebrate some joy and humanity in the Black arts, and then have other African Americans in newspapers actually celebrate your struggles and your joy and communicate that to an audience that's not necessarily reading the archives in the same way that we have the opportunity to do so. So I have hopefully that larger goal, that larger mission.
Thank you all. We're going to turn to the questions. And Chris, who are you going to handle the questions?
That's a wonderful question, man. I would be happy to read through. We should just go ahead and announce if you do have to send us your chat. And I think the Q&A is also working. We do have one question we could start with. That is from Carla Tillman. Were the stories in the Black press that covered arts performed in domestic rather than public spaces, such as quilting, weaving, and/or embroidery? Community practices were very much about identity and often resistance, but much less public than theatrical performances or vaudeville. Thank you for that question.
So that seems to me, it's a great question about fine arts. Did any of you all run across there were all kinds of artists. I mean, of course, we have on the cover Jacob Lawrence, but there were many other sculpture painters, Augusta Savage, in history, we kind of put things aside. So did anybody run anything about the kind of fine arts, painting, all of those kinds of things?
So yet again, it's like I can't actually claim expertise, but I do think about this a lot because I think with my engagement with sociological work, there's this question about the materiality. What are the things that people buy? What's in their homes? What sort of signifies particular class status or sort of like the way society or social life should be? And I also think, or want to sort of highlight the fact that when I read this question, I'm currently teaching African American drama at my institution, and we start out with lynching plays. And in lynching plays, all the practices that are, I don't see the name now, but I think it was Carol maybe was asking. Carla was asking about embroidery, about quilting, about sort of this creation of art in very domestic settings. Those things are all performed on stage and part of the genre of the lynching play. And so I was thinking about, then on another level, lynching plays are often performed in domestic settings. They weren't typically performed, like they were not performed on Broadway. They're not even really performed on the theater circuit with like some exceptions. For the most part, they're printed in magazines so that people can read them in their own homes. So we get this really interesting sort of doubling or like over and over again, thinking about what do we create in our homes and what sort of like nurturance do we provide and what does that look like? And so this question actually highlights what artists or figures like Angelina Wells Grimke, Georgia Douglas are doing with their plays, thinking about that kind of domestic work and its significance. And it's like, I think about it a lot. I actually have hopefully like with all my masks in tow, going to like a folk museum sometime soon. But I think the challenge we also face with this question is how, again, the question of preservation. Where is this material? It's still in our homes, or it's like packed away in a box. There isn't always a space for us to sort of recognize and fully, or at least publicly engage with what we sort of keep in our private spaces. And so this question also prompts this idea about, what sort of makes it out of the private sphere and warrants more of our intellectual engagement.
I also have not seen, I don't know that I certainly don't know all the Black press, but I've not seen anything about those kind of embroidery crafts in anything I personally have read, but you do read a fair amount of domestic music making in one way or another. And of course, a lot of it is about the right kind of music that should be learned in the home, right? This kind of ideas about respectability and what is the respectable music and to do. So in that sense, I definitely have seen that sort of domestic arts, but not so much. But one of the things about having everything digitized, one, it's awesome because you can find it if you can pay for it. Like a lot of this is behind paywalls, which is a big problem. I mean, certainly all the major stuff is all behind paywalls, all the major papers. But the downside of that is you do tend to look for keywords, which means I don't necessarily read anything but say the theater page or the music page, and I'm not reading the women's page necessarily, which is where something like that might show up. I'm not necessarily looking at all the ads in a magazine or something where you might see ads for embroidery supplies or something like that. So it does. While we do have so much more availability, and thank goodness during COVID we can get online, as Erica was saying, it does tend to narrow you a bit into what you're absolutely having to find. So you can find a lot, but you might not find, it's not necessarily the width of the whole paper that you're seeing or the whole magazine or whatever.
I think it depends a lot on the paper. So something like the Indianapolis Freeman, that page 5 is a theater page, right? But that means page 4 or page 6 of every issue is going to have something that talks about women's society or domestic arts, not necessarily in the form of embroidery, but perhaps dressmaking. Definitely a lot of discussion of, artistic cooking in terms of, there is a championing of the domestic sphere. But you're right, unless you're looking on page, that's not the stage page, you're not going to find it, but it is there. And I think the main Black newspapers in Chicago, New York, Baltimore, are really good about placing that there, but you have to go searching for it.
Chris, is there other questions? So,
no other questions yet. Let's see. Oh, there is another question. Sorry about that. This is from Tammy Alvin. Erica's point about the quote unquote gaps and excesses of this archive really speaks to me, especially when doing digital research. What advice do the panelists have for digital searching papers that were read quite with the whole page, the paper, not just the article level? Also, what advice do you have for researchers searching by topic across very different presses, now living in the same database? I think about this all the time and would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for the brilliant issue.
I'll go first. So I am actually going to offer more commiseration than complete practical advice to your question, Tammy, because again, as like Michelle was elucidating, like the material can often be there, but I think, there's this physical aspect of it. Like, what are we doing when we're like looking through a page? How can we sort of zoom in and out on different moments? But then also the other challenge is like, some things are not scanned, some things are blurry, some things you need to hold the paper up and like see it. But the thing is, you don't know what you didn't see, and you don't know like whether or not it's like not there. So for me, I will say I am in the field of English, so I'm often inclined to do this. I kind of look into these kind of archival challenges as spaces for speculation and work with what I have. I think about speculation as a way of sort of theorizing, a way of doing homage to like the lost voices. I'm very much thinking about the work and writing of, say, like Saidiya Hartman's recent work, Beautiful Lies, Wayward Experiments, I should say. And it's just beautiful. Oh Lord, I butchered that title, and she'll get me for that. But thinking about Hartman's work, but also, yeah, like there was something else that Michelle was mentioning about, not Michelle, I think it was Kristen actually talking about the keywords. That's when we start to think about the larger institution of like who scanned this and who created this digital archive. This is why I feel as though everyone's always talking about the digital humanities. It's not just because like computers fix everything, but rather there is a bunch of work to be done, figuring out what are the tags, how are sort of things located on a page, and what ends up being zoomed in, and the quality of the image. And it's like, is anyone going to tag quilt? That is the question. Like, is anyone going to tag quilt? They might tag domestic, but are they going to tag quilt? Are they going to tag embroidery? These are different skill sets. These are like warrant some attention, but who is putting all this data in, and then what happens to it? So I think, I think this question about how to look at it, I think you have to be generous with yourself and recognize what you notice and kind of tracking it, and then yielding into that space of speculation when you can. And sort of expanding on what you have, but also, yeah, it's like those tags, that metadata, the sort of finding aids, they will not tell you everything, and that work still needs to be done.
Well, that sounds like another special issue for us to to work on, because it's absolutely right. I mean, who's doing this? What are the tags? What's all of the kind of input sources? One of the things that I think that as we think about that, this is certainly a wonderful foray and beginning. So I think we ought to. I want to commend you all just a great beginning. And, we have something that Sherry and I do all the time is we have to read the last, before this goes out, one of us or Chris, we have to read the entire issue all. And I want to tell you all, it read marvelously, and I really want to commend you all for such a great job. We don't have to have our pens out that much, and that says something. This was very artfully done. So I want to commend both the guest editor and the writers, and that this is a start. We all make contributions to scholarship, right? We're not, one of my students said, is there a definitive book on? And I said, well, I don't think there's a definitive book. We used to talk in that language, sort of encyclopedia. There's a definitive work on such and such, but there are always, constant interpretations, way of reusing ideas. And I want to thank you all for what I see as just pretty exciting and work. Any more questions from you, Chris?
None yet. I should also correct that last question came from our other co-editor, Sherry Tucker. So apologies for that. That was Sherry's question. No other questions yet.
So
Go ahead.
Since we don't have another question, I'm thinking about Sherry's question about, what are some practical things to do? And I do think it's easy when you are looking at some kind of database and you just put in whatever your keyword is and you get 500 results. And I think Sherry is right to say it in one database, it can mask like, what kind of communities are you looking at? How big is this paper? Is this a specialized paper? Is it a bigger paper? And it becomes really important to not just take out whatever data you're looking for, or you're so excited about this one article, but to really pay attention to those larger things. Sometimes zoom out on the whole page and find the really Lucy and I are completely obsessed with this one opera singer named Theodore Drury, and I found a picture of him that was mislabeled in the actual in this paper because I had zoomed out. I was looking for something totally different. I had zoomed out on the page just to see like what else was on that page, and there's this picture of this guy that we're totally obsessed with, and I'm like sending her an email. Oh my God, I found a picture I've never seen of Theodore Drury. So I think being aware, it's easy to get really tunnel vision, really easy to sit at your computer, look up 7 hours later and go, oh, look, I've read 100 articles right now. But to try to every now and then take the bigger view and have a sense of what are the papers in an individual database. I've gotten to the point where if I'm looking for something particular, I'll look at a particular database because I know the kinds of papers that are in that database. So a lot of it is just working with this archive just like any other archive, but trying to balance between the tunnel vision that you can get, that it encourages, that kind of searching encourages, and every now and then sort of zooming back, I think is my best advice.
Yeah, I think it really highlights just how hard it is to find like moments of serendipity when working with digital sources, right? You don't have that feeling of, leafing through the folder in the archive and being like, what's that thing that I wasn't expecting to find here, this thing that got slipped between the pages. It's so much harder to do that in digital forms. This is like very practical, but sometimes on ProQuest historical newspapers, if I'm downloading articles, there's an option to download article or download full page. So sometimes I try to like go to the full page view just to kind of literally mimic that experience of what it would be like to see the article in its full setting and to kind of page through an issue in that way. And, just in pragmatic terms, you can't do that with every source you read, or else we would never get past like one issue of the Defender. But I do think that just being really creative and kind of experimental in the way that we use these archives is a really important thing to do. Because as everyone, Kristen and Erica have been saying, there's just so much material that is out there and not actually, hard to find, but it does require like a level of openness to the sources that are present.
I have this one question, because I'm thinking about this a lot. This is, the Black artists have tend to be what I call highly democratic, thinking about democracy. They're not just the arts, but they're really thinking about and practicing democracy. Would you concur with that? Would you agree with that? I sense that the practices that they want to have are pluralistic. They want to, have freedoms to do. So this, in many ways, I came away thinking about this issue, about the kind of highly democratic sphere which these artists are trying to create.
I think the artists, yes, they'd like to be democratic and egalitarian and have as many voices heard as possible. But I think once you start talking about a level of professionalization, that a lot of those democratic goals kind of go out of the window, because they're faced with a bureaucratic hierarchy that decides who's going to be on stage, who's going to be heard, who's going to wear which costume, where you're going to perform. And I think the struggle that I really see with a lot of these theatrical performers is that, and having these circuits that are in the midst of segregation, that they're trying to, at the one hand, replicate some of the things that they see in big time vaudeville. And on the other hand, they're still trying to have as many people as possible, right? So if you want to join the stage and you play the harmonica with your nostrils, and that is a person, the nostril harmonica blower, there's a room for you, come on in, right? But you're not going to make the Palace in New York, right? You're going to be, someplace in a theater in Galveston, right? So it's that tension between, is this professional? What do we mean by professional? And who's actually the audience that a lot of these people are performing for? In many of the cases, a lot of the performers that I've been reading about eventually become the managers, right? And so they can give the people what they want because they were the people, right? They were the ones in the audience who saw themselves on stage when they went to one of these performances and says, I can't sing, but I can hula hoop, so I can be in vaudeville, right? So it's that tension that's happening, that you can have as many voices as possible until it becomes more professionalized and more of a business.
Okay. Anybody else about that question?
So this question is one that actually touches on something that I grapple with. So I'm probably just gonna give more questions or more inquiries to your question rather than a solid answer. Going back to what I was mentioning about Anderson's Imagine Communities and the press as being kind of this venue towards nation, or a means of creating a more ideal nation that includes everyone. I do think that aspiration is at stake very often in the Black press, and is probably in fact heightened by the arts itself. But much like Michelle was saying, like, there is still this sense of hierarchies always tend to unfold. And so for me, I don't know, like, I feel as though I intuit something when I read these pieces. When I flip through the pages, I see a kind of recognition of both individuality and community that doesn't always have a place in everyday life. Like this sense of these presses drawing from, or even Vivian talking to different people around the nation, talking to, in the women's era, getting articles from different parts and regions. There is this democratic sense, sheerly in terms of the regions that they're coming from. But at the same time, it's like, what article gets published, what sort of fits into the broader perspective of that particular periodical, which is, it's like, that's kind of the challenge. Like, most periodicals do become institutions, and like institutions have sort of pragmatic things to consider, like, how are we going to publish our next issue? What is this going to cost? The women's era, it goes under because like there's no more money. I think about, the Harlem Renaissance periodical. That's one edition of Fire. That one edition, that to me was incredibly artistic and incredibly democratic, and there was only one. And so I feel as though those imperatives or those sort of aspirations are often present in these texts, but their sustainability or how long that sort of democratic impulse lasts is very tenuous.
Yeah, and the last thing I want to add here is, as a kid who grew up with Ebony and Jet magazine, I'm waiting for now someone to write about how the arts were treated in Ebony and Jet magazines, because that's always fascinating to me. In Ebony, you were stars, so I would love to see that, because this research you have begun adds on to lots of different questions that people are researching, so and so forth. I should say that my colleague Sherry Tucker is also doing work in many ways in this area. She's working on a jazz museum, and she'll be talking about that tomorrow on another Zoom. We're all on Zoom talking about these things, but we can get it out to a wider audience. But it's an exciting piece, and I want to recommend that you tell people about this issue. That we're always excited for our special issues. One that's coming out in the fall on the environment, a double issue, which talks about the kind of various meanings of environmentalism from European scholars on one side, and North American scholars about issues of race and social justice. So we're excited about that, and it's our hope when we put out these issues that we're entering it into a conversation. One of the things that we find so important, and which you've done so well, is accessibility. Our audience for MASA is 11 states, and we don't just talk to people who work in research universities. Our work goes to people in community colleges, AMSJ. They go to people who are at four-year colleges, teaching universities. So we're excited about this, and it's accessible, it's readable for lots of different audiences. So you all your people ought to commend themselves for this, and we are we're grateful that you sent it to us, and grateful for all of the hard work. Writing an article is as hard as writing a book. I mean, because you got to make an argument in 25, 30 pages and boom. And so you've done really wonderful. Any other questions before we we're coming down to the hour, Chris?
No other questions. There was a really wonderful comment by H.R. Cudwell. I just wanted to send a warm thanks to the editors who worked so hard, especially with me, on this amazing collection. So much invisible labor in the Academy, especially for POC and women. On that note, I would also just want to acknowledge the work that everybody in the journal did. Ashley Aranda is our undergraduate creative fountain, doing all kinds of incredible work for this journal over the past several months. So big thanks also to Bobby Cervantes, Elizabeth Willem, and Sherry Tucker and Randall. Incredible crew to work with, and very collective project, and it's been wonderful to do it. Last thing I would say is that the issue introduction is available for free for a short time. So if people are interested in looking to the introduction and reviewing the journal itself, it's available now, and you can find that on Twitter or on the homepage of the journal. Yeah,
thanks for mentioning that. And just to note that we are not an open access journal. We use our revenue to help get our graduate students and also our undergraduates. So we try to make sure that we have some funds in the kitty to make sure we put out a quality, but also to do justice to our assistants. So we wanted to open it up. We thought the introduction will spark a lot of other conversations among historians, among other people. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for this rich issue and for your time this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll be pushing it.
Thanks.
Alrighty. Bye-bye now.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.